Welcome to the Better Rivals Primer on identifying zone coverages. My name is Oscar.
My name is David.
I was hoping that you would remember and go back to just old times.
I was not prepared for that. It threw me off. Took me
Yeah.
so long to get used to staying quiet after you would say my name is Oscar. It's hard going back the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, permanent host now. We got to think about whether or not we throw it back to the old intro, but we are going to go through. This is going to be a 3-video series to help you better identify zone coverages. We're going to start out with some cover 2. We're going to go into cover 4, cover 6 in the next video, and the final video is going to be cover 3 in fire zone. Now, if you've listened to the podcast already, then you are a step ahead. But we're going to review the areas of the field that we discussed on the podcast with some visuals. We're going to detail the responsibilities of each of the players in these zones, and we're going to provide a framework for identifying the zone coverages, and then follow that up with an example play so you can see the assignments of the play out on the field. And just a reminder that we are going to be talking about zone coverages, not really about man coverage and not really about match coverage, although in the 3rd video, we'll probably do a little match coverage teaser. But let's start with just a picture of what the field zones look like, because this is going to be the base of the soup that every other coverage that we discuss is going to pull from in order to make the recipe that is the coverage. So David, what are the zones here, and what are the underneath zones, and what are the deep zones?
Yeah, so this is basically as you're a defensive coordinator and you're trying to figure out, right, how do I defend the field, and you're going to play some sort of zone coverage. These are kind of the general ways that the field gets split up, where I can have a defender that becomes responsible for one of these areas. So you can see these ones here are going to be my deep zones. So at most, I'm really going to have 4 ways that I can split that up. And that would be, I think, the way you're most comfortable with that, right? If you can have 4 guys that are deep defenders here that are splitting the field up only into quarters, you should feel pretty comfortable with your ability to defend the deep pass and not have any one of these guys too stretched, right, and having too much ground to cover. But of course, we know we can kind of divide that up among fewer defenders if needed, either 3 or 2 here. And so that's kind of what those stacks are for. But as we get to the underneath areas of the field here, we have 6 potential zones. Really, it's 3 different zones to each side of the field. So kind of working from the inside out, you've got the hook, you've got the curl next, and then finally in the wide area of the field, you're going to have the flat.
And ultimately, these underneath players are responsible for about 15 yards off the line of scrimmage. The intermediate routes in the NFL are generally going to break around 10 to 15 yards. So you can see, if you've got your eyeglasses on, 15 yards is about where that underneath zone area ends. And this is where ideally you want underneath defenders to be able to defend. We talked about that no cover zone in that first 5 yards. And so really, these defenders need to get depth, because if they allow players to get behind them and they're in front of the deep defenders, then all of a sudden your quarterback is making some money and they're throwing to their wide receivers because it's going to be a relatively easy completion. So those underneath defenders, a reminder, they're always going to play deep to short. They're going to get depth and then work downfield in order to keep things in front of them.
All right, and so we're going to get to kind of a video example here, and this is going to be like we're gonna kind of spend a little bit of time on this clip. So first, just kind of want to call out those areas that we were just looking at on the graphic and kind of identify where they actually are on the field. So when you're kind of got the all 22 angle pulled up here and you're trying to kind of figure this stuff out, you have some rough landmarks to look at for what those zones are going to be. And so the flat area, this is where we're talking about. So again, line of scrimmage, kind of right here at the 34-yard line. It's this wide area of the field out here that's going to be your flat area. As we move inside the curl, usually the drop landmark for the curl is going to be somewhere right here around the top of the numbers or so. So that's kind of the area that they're going to work to, because if you think about it from an offense's perspective, and if they're going to run a curl route, a lot of times the curl route's going to break right around the inside of the numbers. And so that's why they're going to work to that area there. And then finally, with the hook in the middle of the field, usually kind of the outside of the hash is the area that you're going to see those underneath defenders work to.
Yeah, so if you think of landmarks, a really good way to remember them is just going to be hash number sideline. that's going to be kind of your zones working out. And that's not the name of them, obviously. It's going to be a little bit different. But oftentimes, if you're just thinking, okay, what's the landmark in the middle of the field? Well, it's going to be the hash. And then you get the numbers, and then you get the sideline out on the flat. When you're thinking of the framework of identifying coverages, right? You remember we talked about on the podcast how you want to identify your pass rushers, your deep defenders, and then that's going to give you your underneath defenders, and your underneath defenders will ultimately unlock what the identification of the coverage is. And so we're going to go through some of that on this play, and we're going to start with cover two. And that's going to be it's not going to be a Niners defensive structure because they played like 5 cover 2 snaps, David, over the course of the year.
Yeah, it turns out they don't play a whole lot of cover 2, and the examples that they did have weren't really great for the kind of things that we're looking for here, where you have a little bit more vanilla type roles, actually guys dropping back, and you don't get into any more complex stuff. So yeah, we had to settle for an example with the Niners on offense here.
Yeah, so we're coming in hot with a trigger warning and saying that if you haven't seen or rewatched the Super Bowl, avert your eyes for maybe the next couple of minutes through the end of this video. But with cover 2, you think to yourself, okay, if you're rushing 4 players, then likely you've got, and you've got 2 deep defenders and you've got 5 underneath defenders. And so that's what we're going to take a look at here initially as this play begins to run. So the initial part of the play, you've got what looks like a single high look. And then at the snap, you see 2 things happen. One, let's confirm the rush. Let's confirm how many players are getting after the quarterback. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Great. So now we're looking, okay, we've got coverage defenders. Now at the snap, where are people moving? It looked initially like a single high look, but then you see this other safety that looks like he's up near the line of scrimmage just bail straight out into a deep zone. And so now I see, okay, I've got 4 rushers. I've got 2 deep zone defenders, and that tells me I've got 5 underneath defenders. This is likely cover 2.
Yeah. And so as we kind of identify now so just again, we've got here are my 2 safeties that are working back to the deep half of the field. So they're dividing up that deep area in half among the 2 of them. And then that leaves, of course, these 5 guys here as my remaining underneath players. And so when we look at where they're dropping, we can kind of start to identify what role they have within that coverage, right? And so the thing that may throw it off, and so I guess this is a good time to call out that these landmarks are always going to be a little fluid. Ultimately, what the defense is going to be looking at and potentially adjusting those landmarks off of is the offensive formation. And so with the Niners here, we have a pretty condensed formation, right? I've got my receivers tight into the formation, tight to the offensive line there. They're not spreading the field wide. And so that means as my defense and my coverage players underneath, my landmarks are going to kind of condense along with that because we're kind of playing really between the numbers here. And so as we kind of let this roll again, we can look, okay, cover 2, my outside corners usually, and my 2 outside most underneath players are going to be my flat defenders. So we get this corner here, and we get this corner here that are going to be working to the flat. As we move inside, so we've got now this guy here, this guy here. These are going to be my curl defenders, right? So I've got, if you remember back to the podcast, we talked about those 5 underneath roles. We're going to have 2 flat defenders, 2 curl defenders, and then 1 hold defender in the middle, which is, again, the hole is a refresher from the pod. Kind of the area really between the hashes, a little bit more of a generic term, not a clear landmark, but it's somebody that really is just responsible for playing in the middle of the field. And so you can think about it as between the hashes. You can think of it as encompassing both of the hooks, however you want to do it, but it's going to be somebody that's sitting in the middle of the field. And so that's Tyrann Mathieu here is my final underneath defender in this cover 2. Is he's kind of sinking a little bit deeper as the Tampa 2 type player, if you've heard of that, right? So he's a little bit deeper than the rest of these guys, but those are my 5 underneath roles in cover 2.
And so here, what the defense is clearly trying to do is to disguise the coverage at the snap. And you can always see through the disguise by seeing the defenders, how they move to their landmarks and seeing their initial steps. That deep safety, you see he's getting width. He's getting to that over the top of the numbers area at the snap. And that other safety is going to basically start bailing and do something similar on the other side of the field. They're going to identify who those deep defenders are immediately. That once you're able to do that at the snap and then see the four rushers, then it's just trying to suss out where your underneath defenders are and what their roles are. And knowing that in a cover two, if this is likely cover two, which it ends up being, you've got two curl players, two flat defenders, and a hole player. It's pretty easy to kind of work which one is which, and then you can basically say, like, yes, this is absolutely for sure cover two, and now you've identified the coverage. So at least for cover two, that wraps it up. If you've got any questions, definitely leave them in the comment section on the Patreon. If anything is unclear, if you want us to explain anything further on the video or the coverage. But if not, stay tuned for the next video, which is going to cover cover four and cover six with some play examples and play diagrams.